Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Glad to have with us, as always, on a Tuesday, Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for calling in.
Hey, good to be here on Thanksgiving week.
Dr. Ostrower, there was a couple of court rulings yesterday. One of them was about the ability of a president to prevent or not prevent members of an administration from testifying. Tell us about that.
Well, the ruling was by a judge, and I'm not sure whether it was in Washington or in New York, but it was a judge who essentially said that for 250 years we have had a system of checks and balances. She says that no one is above the law, no president is above the law. She made the point that presidents are not kings, and therefore they must respect the terms of the Constitution of the United States. There is indeed a separation of powers principle, and I think it's important to realize when we say a separation of powers, it's not simply that, the executive works on one track and the Congress on another track and the judiciary on a third track, and they have little to do with each other. The fact of the matter is that I think, as most of us realize, each branch checks the power of the other. And when there is a potential abuse of power by one branch, the other branches can check that abuse. And that's what the judge was saying yesterday. So effectively what she said is that by arguing that no man is above the law, that the president cannot prevent, in this particular case, the White House attorney, his name was, he's no longer working there, McGahn, from testifying before the House of Representatives. Now, Mr. McGahn's testimony is not really going to be particularly relevant to the whole issue of impeachment because, in fact, he left the administration before the impeachment hearings began. He had nothing, as far as I know, to do with Ukraine, but he had a lot to do with the Mueller investigation. And as a matter of fact, it is reported, and I have no reason to doubt this, that the president had asked him to fire Mueller. And I think that's what the House wants to hear. Is that an impeachable offense? The answer is yeah, sure it is, because it goes to the issue of the obstruction of justice. But I think the more important point is that the president can't do whatever he wants. He said at one point, and this is just about, maybe 6 months ago, that Article 2 of the Constitution, that's the article that deals with executive power, that Article 2 of the Constitution allows the president to do, said President Trump, whatever he wants to do. And that is not the case. That is not true. That is not historically, accurate. And that's the point that the judge was making in yesterday's ruling. I guess I would, mention one other thing. And that is that, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest single statement of American political theory is embodied in what we call the Federalist Papers. Now, these were written about 250 years ago, back in the 1780s. They were authored by Alexander Hamilton and by the first Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay, and also by James Madison, who would, of course, eventually become president. And they came to terms with what they feared would be, number one, the possibility that you would have a corrupt president. In Federalist Paper number 75, they address exactly the fact that the president is not above the law. And also in Federalist Paper number 1, which was authored by Alexander Hamilton, he makes the point that beware of these politicians, if you will, these officials, who tell you what you want to hear. He says they begin as your friends and they end up as demagogues. They end up, in other words, as threatening the very, very liberties that otherwise we say we wish to preserve. And I think that that's, in many ways what's happening right now. That's the issue ultimately in respect to the impeachment hearings, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about this in the next few weeks.
Talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, anything in foreign policy you'd like to talk about?
Well, there is, but I guess I would want to, before I address the foreign policy issue per se, let me kind of comment, if I will, on the subject of transparency. President Trump says he has been the most transparent president in American history. just as he says he has been the most supportive of soldiers in American history, of our war fighters, as he said again just yesterday in a press conference. But the fact of the matter is that he has been anything but transparent. He has blocked many of his officials. In fact, he's blocked virtually all of the people working for his administration and some who are no longer working for the administration from testifying before Congress on the impeachment hearings. If he was really transparent, he'd have nothing to hide. If he was truly transparent, he would allow his chief of staff Mulvaney to testify. He would allow all of the other members of his administration, including State Department officials like Mike Pompeo, to testify. But he won't do that. And when it comes to the issue of transparency, one might note that he could, if he wished, testify himself before the House committee that had concluded its hearings just last week. He hinted that he would do this, but of course he did not do it, just as he hinted that he would testify during the Mueller investigation, testify in person, and he did not do that. So I think that, when it comes to transparency, there's a lot to be desired by this president. He is the only president since John Kennedy not to reveal, not to open up, not to make public his income taxes. Well, I think that, most of us who are critics of the president would say, well, why is he not opening up? Why doesn't he make these income taxes available to us? Is it because there are issues having to do with investments in Russia or in Ukraine? Are there issues having to do with his actual wealth? He claims to be, a billionaire 10 times over, but it's not clear that he's a billionaire at all. And it won't be clear until he opens up those income taxes. Might it be because he does not provide monies to charities that he claims that he provides? The answer is we don't know. And we're not going to know unless he truly does become transparent. And I have no reason to think after 3 years that the president is going to be more transparent than he has been in the last 3 years.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, Dr. Ostrower, a comedian named Chelsea Handler, made an interesting observation. And she said that Chelsea Handler told Meghan McCain that Lindsey Graham has undergone a major change since the death of John McCain. He exhibited one type of policy and politics while McCain was alive, and since his death, he's gone from a loyalty to John McCain to a loyalty to President Trump. Would you agree with that?
Completely. It's puzzling. I think that many of us who respected Lindsey Graham certainly no longer do so. He seems to be in some ways just a puppet right now of the president. He is seeking to protect the president in just about every way, in ways including, any, quote, investigation of the Bidens. The idea that the Bidens, and this is something that has come out of the White House repeatedly over the past 6 months or so, what the president has argued is that the Bidens were involved in corrupt activities in Ukraine. And, of course, it has something to do with the fact that Hunter Biden was on the board of a Ukrainian company that is, in fact, that has been connected with corruption. But there is absolutely zero evidence, none whatsoever, to the effect that Vice President Joe Biden was in any way connected to this. And yet Lindsey Graham won't let this go. During the investigation, during the hearings again just last week, Fiona Hill, who is an official she is on the National Security Council. She is the Russian and the Ukraine specialist on the National Security Council, completely debunked the idea that Joe Biden was somehow involved in corruption there. What she said, among other things, is that this is a fantasy. And not only is it a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that is being promoted by the Russian government. It's being promoted by the Russians as part of a disinformation campaign. President Trump has picked this thing up. He will not let it go. And Lindsey Graham is doing exactly the same thing. I think that Mr. Graham ought to be, how shall I say, I think he should be ashamed of himself.
We're going to take a quick break, check the forecast, and we'll be back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Stay with us.
Selecting a nursing home for a loved one isn't easy until you've discovered Hornell Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation. Hornell Gardens delivers the highest level of care, compassion, and commitment with amenities and activities that will enrich body, mind, and spirit. It's a place that's close to home. Stop in for a tour of Hornell Gardens, located at 434 Monroe Avenue in Hornell, or to learn more, call 585-222-CARE or visit hurlbutcare.com.
Checking in with meteorologist Rob Carroll, who says, into each life, you guessed it, some rain must fall.
That's right, and into your life, Brian, we do send some rain, but not today. It arrives late tonight and continues into tomorrow. Keep that in mind if tomorrow's your travel day for the holiday. You'll encounter rain or showers across much of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states tomorrow, even out into the Ohio River Valley. Looking at a lot of cloudiness drifting across the state this morning, but there are some breaks, and I think we'll have some intervals of sunshine. It's going to be a mild day with a southwesterly wind ahead of a storm that's producing snow in Colorado and Nebraska this morning. Our temperatures will get to 55 later today. We'll have clouds, a couple of showers late tonight. Lows are going to be around 40. Tomorrow, rainy and breezy, mild too. Highs 55 to near 60. The rain ends tomorrow night as a few widely scattered showers of rain or wet snow. It'll be breezy and turning colder, lows near 35. Looks like a mostly cloudy and breezy Thanksgiving day for the southern tier. May even see a few flurries or a snow shower. Highs on Thursday, 35 to 40. And will stay fairly cloudy and chilly on into Friday, Brian. Sunrise this morning, I should say, 7:15. Sunset tonight at 4:41.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. We're not going to talk about this day in history. We're going to talk about something that Gary's recently read in the American Revolution, but there was something you wanted to say first, Dr. Ostrower.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, if I may, about foreign policy. Foreign policy tends to be, we as citizens, the press, generally speaking, tends to focus on domestic developments such as the impeachment hearing and things like that. But I think something happened in foreign policy. I think it was just yesterday. I'm not sure of the date. That is kind of interesting to me, and that is that President Trump, who says he wants our allies to pay more for their own defense, which of course I think is laudable. By the way, I might add that President Obama had done exactly that. But in either case, he gave the South Koreans a bill. Okay, now we have troops in South Korea. Most of that money, most of the expenses of that are paid by the South Korean government. And what President Trump did, apparently without any real warning, is he doubled the amount of money that we are charging the South Koreans for their own defense. Now, what I find interesting about this is that it came as a surprise. That not only came as a surprise, but that it essentially further undermines the relationship between the United States and South Korea. Normally, you negotiate these sorts of things. You don't, if you have allies, you don't surprise them in quite this way. And I think it's consistent with some of what Trump has done in respect to his relationship with the North Korean dictator. What he's doing, in other words, is weakening our relationship with South Korea, and to the extent that he undermines that alliance, he makes the Far East less stable than it has been. And he's doing much the same thing in Europe. Think about, if you will, the main objectives of President Putin of Russia. If I had to outline what those main objectives are, I would say number one is to weaken NATO. Number two is to weaken the European Union. And number three is essentially to weaken American democracy. And I think you'd have to argue that Putin has been rather successful, in part because of the cooperation he's gotten with President Trump. He's been rather successful in all of these things. And so, what this ultimately means is that the stability, the kind of structure of peace that was established after World War II with the United Nations, with the World Bank, with the IMF, with NATO, with a whole bunch of other treaties, including one, in the Far East, that all of these treaties, that this entire structure is being undermined by an administration. Why the president is doing this remains, puzzling to me. You're not going to hear much about this from, Mr. Hannity or from Mr. Limbaugh, but I think that is something that all of us should be not only focusing on, certainly aware of, but worried about. The other point I would like to make is that, I've been doing some reading recently about the American Revolution, and I would like to kind of make a point about the Revolution that is probably unknown to most of us. Certainly it was, largely unknown to me, and I happen to know something about American history during the 18th century. And what I'm learning is that the importance of the French Navy. Remember, the United States was allied with France during the French Revolution. At the beginning of the Revolution, we had a ragtag army, we had an amateur army. It was poorly organized, it was poorly trained, it was poorly equipped, and it was reasonably well led for one reason, and that one reason is in the name of George Washington. Well, that ragtag army managed to, maintain itself. A few months later, that is 15 months after the war began, the Declaration of Independence was written, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and that declaration was in many ways a signal to the French that we were for real as an independent country, that you could count on us against England, because certainly there was a lot of competition back in that period between the English and the French. And that declaration led, less than 2 years later, to an actual treaty between the United States and the French government. And it was a military treaty. And what that military treaty said, among other things, is that the French would send their army, led by the Marquis de Lafayette, most of us know who that is, and also their navy to the New World. Initially, the French spent most of their time in the West Indies, and this becomes kind of important back in 1780 and early 1781. There was a hurricane in the West Indies that may have been the most, how shall I put it, the strongest, the most violent hurricane in the last 200 years. We estimate, and of course back in that period they couldn't define this exactly, but we estimate that the winds reached up to 200 miles per hour. Well, it didn't decimate the French fleet, fortunately, because of the location of the hurricane, but the fleet realized, the French Navy realized they better get out of the West Indies, and they sailed up to North America. And they became very, very much a part of the process of ultimately defeating the British. And for this reason, because the French admiral, his name was de Grasse, the French admiral wound up taking control of the area around the Chesapeake Bay, which would be the final major battle of the war. That's where the Battle of Yorktown was going to be fought. And because the French controlled the Atlantic Ocean, and because they controlled access into the Chesapeake, the British fleet was simply unable to aid the British soldiers under Lord Cornwallis. And consequently, Cornwallis was kind of cornered in Yorktown. There was a siege of Yorktown that lasted for weeks and weeks. The British were unable to resupply Cornwallis because the French controlled the sea. And as a final result of all of that, Cornwallis had to surrender, and that became the last major battle of the war. So I guess what I'm arguing is that we could not have won. We would not have won the Revolution. Certainly would not have won it when we did in 1781 without the support of both Lafayette, with his troops on the ground. There were about 8,000 French soldiers who were fighting with approximately the same number of American soldiers, and also the real critical importance of the French fleet to prevent the British from reinforcing their own forces.
That's very interesting, Dr. Ostrower. We have about 3 minutes left. Did you want to stay on this topic, or could I get a couple This Day in History questions in?
Well, I would like to say, I guess, one more thing about the American Revolution, and it is related to what I have just said. You know, we tend as Americans to focus on our victories and not on our defeats. Probably the most, the biggest battle during the American Revolution was the Battle of Brandywine, which occurred south of Philadelphia. We didn't win that battle, and when I talk to students about that, they've never heard of the Battle of Brandywine. Likewise, the Battle of Monmouth Junction, the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. It was the longest battle of the entire war. It was one of the costliest battles of the war. But once again, the American troops, the Patriots, did not win that battle against the British. And so, how did we finally prevail? Because, there were some victories, not the least of which was the victory in Princeton and the victory in Trenton on Christmas Eve, when the British were probably more drunk than they should have been. And, of course, maybe the most important single battle of the entire war, which was fought in Saratoga, New York. The Battle of Saratoga, where General Burgoyne, where the British general was defeated by the Americans, and I might add, the American general, a brilliant general, was a fellow by the name of Benedict Arnold, and of course we know what happened after that. Benedict Arnold, defected to the British. He committed treason. Benedict Arnold was, along with Cornwallis, the main British general in the area of the Carolinas and Virginia toward the end of the war in 1780 and 1781. And I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons why the Americans fought as fiercely as they did, and in some ways as well as they did, is because back in that period, 1780, 81, down in the Carolinas and into Virginia, because they wanted to defeat Arnold. They wanted, in a sense, to pay him back for his treason. Now, he was relieved of command just before the final battle, but nevertheless, the story of Benedict Arnold and the American Revolution is even more complicated, I think, than most of us realize.
Gary, down to about 60 seconds, do you have a sense of how the British people feel about the American Revolution now in 2019?
Yeah, I do. I think that they view it as kind of a sideshow, I suppose. Look, there's a lot of pro-American sentiment in Great Britain. Less today with President Trump, of course. I think he certainly alienated many people in Europe, but I don't know that has any effect whatsoever in respect to British attitudes toward the American Revolution. Do they view it as a great tragedy? I don't think so. We're long past the age of imperialism, the age of colonialism. The British continue to view us as, in some ways, their cousins, and that had been true certainly going up to leading up to the American Revolution. And I think that one of the reasons why the Americans, in many ways, turned against the British is because the British used the German troops called Hessians during the American Revolution. It seemed to be a betrayal of that, how shall I put it, that family relationship that we had with Great Britain.
Do you think that World War II turned things around for the relationship or between America and England, or maybe before then?
Oh, I think it certainly did. Until World War II, the British were in some ways the dominant power in that relationship. After World War II, that of course turned around. And I think that at the beginning of World War II, it was Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, who was really calling the shots. For instance, he was the guy who said, "We are not going to invade Europe. We're going to invade North Africa." And this is 1942. But by 1944, Churchill still did not want to invade the continent, and of course it was the Americans under Eisenhower and President Roosevelt who insisted on what we're going to eventually call the D-Day landings, and that was absolutely critical. And the reason why Eisenhower and Roosevelt were able to do that is precisely because the number of men, the amount of military equipment had turned the tide. The British by 1944 were clearly a secondary power to the Americans.
With that, Dr. Ostrower, we have to go. Hey, I want to thank you for a very interesting show.
Have a great Thanksgiving.
You too.